Early on in the first test between India and Australia, Fox Sports put up a graphic about Mitchell Starc in the day-night tests and how good he was. Warne was commentating, and what started as a conversation about how Starc was much more deadly in day-night tests than standard day tests, it ended up with a conversation about how Starc was a tail-order killer. Warne focused on the fact that in day tests he averaged 36 against the top order and 14 against the tail. Essentially, he suggested that Starc's record against the top order wasn't that good, but that he was destroying the tail to make up for it. Now, let's not go too deep into the rabbit hole of Warne-Starc's feud, but obviously, if Warne can frame something negative against Starc, he quite often does. But this time he had numbers. So I looked at the numbers. I even did it by their splits. Starc's day-night record is kind of all over the shop. He doesn't do as well against the tail as you'd expect, and he's incredible against the top order. Some of this might just be because it's a small sample size, though he is arguably the best white ball bowler in the world. And so the pink ball does act slightly more like the white one than it does the red one at times. So it could be something to do with that. And Starc's day record does show a huge differential between tail and top order, and so do his overall numbers. But guess what? So do the averages of all bowlers. And of course they would. When you really drill down, Starc is 12% better against the top order than a normal bowler, and 18% better against the tail. It certainly shows he's better against the tail, but it also shows he's really good against the top order. Quite often you do hear about a stigma against certain bowlers, and they're thought of as just being good because they gorge on the tail. And Warne was basically using that in his blood feud with Starc. But as we've just shown, overall it's kind of not true. And even when you look at Starc's day record, he's still an above average bowler against the top order. Now, Warne wouldn't have ever looked up any of these numbers, so let's not blame him for slightly misunderstanding. But it is worth using this conversation to look at what a unique and interesting bowler Starc is. Starc takes very early wickets, like in the first over. After Anderson, he's taken the most first over wickets of anyone in the game since he began his career. And he's really good against opening batsmen in general. He has a far better record against them than Broad, Bolt, Rabada and Shami. And he's as good as anyone from over 60 to 80, when most seamers would rather, learn algebra than bowl a delivery. Not to mention that he bowls left arm pace at 90 miles an hour, meaning he gives variety and the chance for some enforcer overs if needed. Starc is an incredible package, so let's just compare him to, another great Australian bowler completely at random. But I also wanted to look at Starc compared to other bowlers of his era, plus I wanted to see if there were people who actually destroyed the tail. So let's start with the most obvious cluster here. The guys who are the greatest against the tail are, pretty much great against everyone else. The real truth here is that if you're a really good bowler, you're probably going to destroy the tail because you're a really good bowler. What you may notice is that there's no real smashing the tail cluster. This cluster here has bowlers who just aren't as good as Wagner, Rabada and Anderson. Stokes is the only bowler here who's worse than average against the top order. And Starc is a long way clear of the average of 36.5 in the last 5 years. Just back on Stokes, he is an all-rounder and he often gets the ball when the top order players are set. So it would make sense that he's a slightly better bowler against the tail. Yasir Shah is probably the closest we have, although it is worth mentioning that Mohammad Abbas is incredible against the tail. But it's also worth mentioning that Mohammad Abbas is incredible against everyone. There is a cluster of seamers who are specialists on the list. It's just that they're top order special. There's probably two reasons: the new ball and their style. If you had an entire team of these, it probably wouldn't work very well. Not only would they be negated by the fact that they'd all get less of the new ball or bowl less in favourable conditions, but on flat pitches, this attack would struggle with the tail. So for all the talk of tail smashers, it's kind of the opposite is true. We have top order specialists. If you could find a tail order destroyer, you might actually match them with a few of these bowlers. And I'll be honest, I really wanted to find a tail order destroyer. So the database I was checking went back to 1999. And I had a look to see if any bowler has ever been a tail specialist in that time. And I found two. And if you were picking two stereotypes of the kinds of bowlers you thought would do well against the tail, I think someone who bowls at 100 miles an hour and someone who rips the ball sideways would probably be on that list. Shoaib Akhtar averaged under 10 against the tail. If you need a break, I'll just sit here for a moment, let you catch your breath. He also averaged just over 30 against the top order. Since 99, the overall average of the top 7 is 40, so he was way above average against top order batsmen. Who would have thunk it? Apparently bowling more than 100 miles an hour against guys who basically can't bat is the only way that you can have a bowling average of under 10 against tail-enders. He was 43% better than the average bowler against the tail. And just quickly, if we compare it to the best bowler against the top order, Glenn McGrath, again, no surprises there, he was 41% better than average against the top order. But if we're looking for someone who was a tail order destroyer who did actually struggle a little bit with the top order, well, we found a few, and we certainly found their king, Stuart McGill. What a very average record he has against the top order, and what an absolutely brilliant record he has against the tail. Although he's not alone, Harbhajan is not far away from him, and if you look in this area, you can see other spinners, Kumble, Shakib, Dan Vittori, and here is Stokes again, suggesting he is pretty much what we thought he might be in the other graph, but certainly over his whole career, he's been a specialist against the tail. And the only seam bowling one we can really find. Now remember, for some of these players, this isn't their entire career, as it does start in 1999, and we still have that top order seam bowling specialist position. And there are two interesting names here, Freddie Flintoff and Chris Martin, because both were thought to be really good bowlers whose records overall didn't stand up. And I think now we can see at least part of that was just because they didn't get the tail out very much. And there is another group here that I found really interesting. Zahir Khan, Ishant Sharma, Umar Gul, Mohammad Shami, and Umesh Yadav all have better than average records against the top 7, but all struggle a little bit when they're bowling against the tail. So I started to think that maybe Seam has just struggled on Asian pitches, but when I had a look at the averages, Seam is in Asia average 17.4 against the tail. It's 17 overall. It's really just this lot who struggle. And if we're going to get this geeky, and we did, I thought I might as well do a geekercise and allow us to pick a sort of perfectly weighted bowling attack. So McGrath and Cummins are the two best bowlers against the top order. So they'd be your first two seamers. Murali is our best spinner, who also happens to be absolutely brutal against the tail. But if you want one more tail end crusher, I'd probably bring Shoaib in. And if you want some all-round balance, right around here you have Pollock and Jadeja. So you just pick whichever one suits you for those particular conditions. But if you're looking a bit more for an extreme bowling attack, I think you'd open up with Hazelwood and Gillespie. Make sure that McGill is definitely your spinner. And then you've got a couple of all-rounders in Shakib and Freddie Flintoff. But after all this, I think you probably just want to see where Mitchell Starc is. Well, he's right here, pretty much in the same place as before. Oh, and just for fun, should we look for Warne as well? That's a really good record against the tail you have there, Shane. Isn't it weird how these two very different men are so close together on this graph? If only we could bring them this close together in real life.